Hi guys, so we're here in this beautiful location at low tides and there are turtles swimming everywhere and I can see the fish. And there's beautiful turquoise color in the foreground. So our objective today is to be able to capture the colors. So what I've done over here is I've mounted the circular polarizer, adjusted the circular polarizer to maximize the color in the foreground. And we've selected this location high up. And I'm going to show you how exposure affects the color. So the first of our 4 steps is to be able to observe the scene. As I look at the scene, I notice that it's beautiful. My foreground element is very colorful, and that's what I want to capture. But there's nothing close in the foreground. So my most important parameter is aperture. I'm going to set the camera at its sweet spot. Okay, so here we go. So in step 2 of our 4-step method, after I observe the scene, I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera on and set my aperture to f8. And let's suppose that you start out with a shutter speed of 400 at f8, okay? And you can see that everything looks dark. Now, the reason is that my square says my foreground element is underexposed by about 2 stops, maybe 2 1/3 stop, okay? And that's why everything looks dark. There's some color in the sky, but not quite enough. So my step number 3 is to be able to adjust my shutter speed to make sure my meter goes to 0. And once that happens, I'm going to go ahead and take a shot. Now when I look at this in the foreground in the shot, I notice that everything in the foreground is just fantastic, but I don't know whether it is colorful enough. So one of the things I can do is I can actually increase the exposure by 2/3 of a stop. And I notice that once I do that, my foreground looks even more colorful. So I'm going to go ahead and try to do that and take a shot. So now I have 2 shots. One where the meter says it's properly exposed and one where the foreground is exposed slightly to the right. Okay. Now I'm going to go home, look at it on the LCD, and pick the one that is the best. Now for this particular shot, since I had 1/60 of a second as my shutter speed, which was fast enough, and I'm not too worried about slow shutter speed, I left my ISO setting on the lowest possible setting, which is 100. And that is to minimize the noise for ISO. All right, so now I can go ahead and preview the shot, and I notice that the one that is exposed to the right for foreground has slight amount of overexposure. Now it may be a problem or it may not be a problem. I may be able to do some sort of recovery in the raw file, so let's hope that works out. We'll see what happens. All right, so we just went through this whole process in a manual mode. What if you like to use your camera in aperture priority mode? Well, you can actually do the same 4 steps. So let me go ahead and turn my camera on, and I'm going to start off with some sort of random aperture of f22, and let's see, and 2.5 seconds of a shutter speed. So let's suppose you start off your camera in aperture priority mode. You can still use our 4 steps to set your exposure and get the colors right. Okay, again, observe the scene around you. All I want to do is capture the colors. There's nothing in the foreground, so my most important parameter becomes aperture. So my first job is to take this and set that to f8. Now, when I set it to f8, I don't have control over shutter speed in aperture priority mode, at least not directly. What I do have control over is the exposure. I can take my exposure plus minus 1 stop, or plus minus 2, or plus minus 3, or whatever else I want, or whatever your camera is capable of. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use the other button to adjust my exposure, and as you can see, I want that exposed slightly to the right, and then I'm going to go ahead and take the shot. Now, when I change my exposure compensation, What the camera did was it actually changed the shutter speed. If my exposure compensation is too high, so if I'm exposed to the right, my colors get washed out. If I am exposed to the left, my colors become dull and the whole scene changes to black, sorry. And so what you want to do is you want to expose it correctly. Now, when I change my exposure compensation, what the camera did was it actually changed the shutter speed. So the question is, why did not change ISO? Well, that's because I've locked my ISO to 100. If I put my ISO to auto, my camera may be tempted to adjust the ISO. But in reality, it actually depends on the way your camera works. My camera will change ISO as a last option because ISO induces noise and reduces the dynamic range. Okay? So when I'm using aperture priority, I like to lock the ISO down so I know what ISO I'm getting and then use exposure compensation to be able to adjust the shutter speed.